Meet a man who, working in harmony with his family, helps bring about an example of pure democracy. Coming up next on Carolina People. Good morning. Welcome to Carolina People. This morning we're at the Fox 43 studio. We're focused on the 2004 Gallivan's Ferry Stump, and we're visiting with one of the coordinators, Billy Holliday. Good morning, Billy.
Good morning. Good morning.
You know, Sally Howard was with us last Thursday, and she talked about 4 ladies as coordinators for putting on the event, but I think she explained that she was representing you and your family.
That's right. That's right.
And so I can kind of call you a coordinator.
That's right. Our co-sponsor is, in the sense that the two families now who have, so to speak, inherited that area, inherited the store and the whole site where this has gone over.
Right.
And so Sally's presence, of course, has been great for us because she's so knowledgeable.
Oh, yeah.
She's probably the most knowledgeable woman I know, maybe, certainly in this county, maybe even the state and Democrats, because she has great history, a long history of working for political candidates. So, and governors, different people.
Absolutely. Real quick about yourself, Billy. Are you originally from the area?
I'm born and raised in Gallivan's Ferry. Now, a technical aside to that is that during the 40s, people were taken to the hospital, mothers were taken to the hospital, which was a break in the tradition of my family at Gallivan's Ferry because my father was born right there in the house, one of the houses at Gallivan's Ferry, right, as was all of his brothers and sisters. Wow. And there were a lot of them. Mm-hmm. And his father was born right there. His name was George Holliday. So. Mm-hmm.
And you said there were a lot of brothers and sisters. I mean, your father had a lot of brothers.
Yes, he had 5 sisters, and he had one brother who lived, 2 brothers who didn't survive beyond 5 years old. Mm-hmm. And I think they were, I forget their names, and one was named George Jr., and I think the first one died, and then there was another George, but they were very young. Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm. And your father was Joseph, and then Russell and Christy's father, John Monroe.
John Monroe, right.
Right.
That's right.
How many homes are there? When you mentioned the homes in Gallivan's Ferry, in Gallivan's Ferry itself, how many homes would there be?
Now?
Back. How about now?
Well, let me trace it back from the beginning. When J.W. Holliday, who was my daddy's grandfather, moved there in the late 1860s. Mm-hmm. There's a long history before that. He was in Horry County in 1852 as a turpentine plantation operator. Mm-hmm. But after the Civil War and after various disruptions, in fact bankruptcies due to war and due to various factors, he ended up at Gallivan's Ferry and started over anew. So they had a house right there where John Monroe's house sits, and the main road was called the PD Road that goes north-south, mm-hmm, from Fair Bluff down to Port Royal. Mm-hmm. It was an old Indian trail. So that house was later built. He had 2 wives, did J.W. Holliday, and the second wife built a big house there. Mm-hmm. And my daddy's father built a house across what would be Highway 501 now, but 501 wasn't there then. Mm-hmm. So that was the house where the branch of the family that survived, that's where they lived. And because the other branch of the family that descended from the second wife, the 2 wives were sisters. And really? The second wife was 27 years younger than my daddy's grandfather.
Is that right?
But they left, as did so many of the other brothers of my grandfather.
And the 2 wives were sisters, you said?
That's right. They were named Grissett, and they were the daughters of a senator, so politics enters right in. And they went to college, which is a very unusual thing. They went to Limestone College, mm-hmm, in the 1850s. Mm. Their father was Senator Reuben George Wooten Grissett. Mm-hmm. And he was a state senator in the antebellum years.
And a Democrat, I assume.
I don't know. I assume so, yes. And I'd have to look at politics in the 1850s to see, mm-hmm, what. The most incredible thing you bring up at that moment is that Charles Joyner, who's professor at Coastal Carolina, mm-hmm, has written a foreword to Catherine Lewis's book. And he shows to me for the first time that Horry County was the only county that remained Democratic all the way through Reconstruction.
Is that right?
And I never knew that until a couple of years ago that he pointed that out. And I think that's just amazing. And, of course, that has a lot to do with the generation of interest in politics at Galvin's Ferry, I think.
Billy, tell me about that, or tell the viewers about that interest in politics in Galvin's Ferry.
Okay. The Galvin's Ferry area, first, it's a geographical significance. That area across the river there at Little Petey River, it was the main entranceway into the county from the mid-state, from the capital. So when people from the outside came in to the county, which was very hard to get around in those days because of the roads being so terrible, so much sand bogs, so many swamps that they circled around the swamps, and it was often impassable. So one thing happened after J.W. Holliday had moved there, and there was a little store that he had bought after he recovered from the last bankruptcy, which happened to be in Cool Spring, which is 10 miles up the road, east. So I've heard on previous shows here but others talk about General Wade Hampton coming to Galvin's Ferry, and people from inner part of Horry County coming in to meeting there. And I remember that it was in the 70s that I was up in the attic of the store, and I was the first one to ever bring this out. And I'm not saying it just because I was up there rummaging, trying to keep from having to do something important. I was rummaging around up in the store, and I came across these billets, these flyers, and they all said, all Democrats come to Galvin's Ferry and meet General Wade Hampton.
Oh, come on.
And they had the date. I can almost remember the date. All those were lost in the fire, but it said something like September 30th, 1876.
That's right.
And so it was something passed around the county, and so it didn't say how many eventually came to the banks of the Little Petey, but that definitely happened. And then later I did see it written up in Catherine Lewis's book. It was well known for a long time that when he came in to Conway, all the Democrats there gathered, and they made sure that Horry County voted for Wade Hampton so that they could oust the carpetbag government, which was Republican at that time. So what I'm saying is that that particular area, in this you have to get a little bit romantic about it. There was no stump speaking then, so to speak, but that meeting, to me, it was a mixture of when the rest of the state joined with the Democratic stronghold of Horry County. Remember, it's the last Democratic county, the only one. And so the people upstate trying to free the state of the carpetbaggers and the scalawags came down to this stronghold where there was a devoted following. And they met there at Galvin's Ferry. And as Tommy Britton says, he's a good historian, and he says, we don't know where we spoke. He was being tactful. He went on to speak in Conway. But here is, to me, is this energy field almost, if you want to get really romantic, and put it in a little bit of modern sciences. When you have people meeting at a special place, it's charged with a certain energy. I could get really romantic and sentimental and say it becomes hallowed ground. You meet so many times, and it's charged with this sense that we can change things. We don't have to be tread upon by this dominating party. And of course that's so important during this time because the Democrats, the dominating party is not the Democratic Party. It's kind of like it was then. This has become a Republican-dominated state, much as it was during Reformation.
Right. One of the fascinating aspects there, of course, it is the farmers coming to power. It is the agrarian sense really coming out there in Galvin's Ferry, and that's something you weren't necessarily seeing throughout the state, or were you? I think that the agrarian movement came out of the Reformation in the sense that upstate where Pitchfork Ben Tillman was notorious, and I think he came to Galvin's Ferry sometime later in the 1900s. But he started the so-called populist movement up there, and in fact it started with stump speakings much earlier than Galvin's Ferry. The stump speaking or the primary speaking phenomenon moved south. It moved northeast, I guess you would say, across down into Horry County. And in 1875, to me, just set the prototype for that kind of thing, where the common people were able to stand up and say to this intruding government, this foreign government for us, for Southerners, go home. It's time for the real people to take over. Now that's kind of a great. You have that kind of confluence of energy and spirit
and yearning, and a place like Gallows Ferry will later become charged with that kind of energy.
Yes.
And you can see it in a lot of the comments that people make. Oh, I enjoyed going there. It's such a wonderful thing. There is a spirit there.
Right.
Now, nobody spoke there in those years, but that's when the spirit, I think, was the seeds of that spirit were sown. So that's why we like to speak of 1876. And of course, as I say, it was me up there hiding from, probably trying to do something for my father, that started the whole thing.
That is fascinating. Well, you know, that tie-in, and of course to think 1954, another very important year in that was 50 years ago, the Fritz Hollings was running for lieutenant governor. And of course, you all are recognizing Senator Hollings.
Yes.
It's 50 years of
Yeah, isn't
service.
that amazing? 50 years to the years. I mean, it's amazing how it works out in that half-century chunk of time, such an important milestone.
It is. It's great. It's great that he can claim 5 decades of service
Isn't that amazing?
When he retires next year. It is very exciting. And of course, for you, having grown up, as you said, being the first to be born outside of the home place, physically in Marion County, and then quickly, I guess, getting back into the home. Just a handful of homes there in Galvins Ferry. Was that? Of course, it would have been perceived as strange to you, but in later years, thinking about coming back to Galvins Ferry and spending a lot of time there, it must have been very interesting.
Yeah, it was a great community. It was a rural community, a crossroads community with a general store. And the general store was the focus of that community. It was the source of everything that people needed to stay alive. Whether it be kerosene. As a little boy, I sold kerosene in the general store there, and almost everybody came up in mules and wagons, with very few cars, and especially in that part of no paved roads except the one that went from Galvins Ferry. But that community itself, to me, became an emblem of the democratic spirit, because you had people living there. Much more people live there then than now. In the little, say, 1,200 acres of land there were dozens of tenant houses where people worked on the farm, and they would help each other. If someone had a poor crop, or if they needed something, or if they needed labor, they would go over and help. And to me, that's a wonderful emblem to me of the whole spirit of the Democratic Party. The fact that people helping out each other and not saying, well, you must not be good enough, your crop failed, therefore, in the Darwinian law of the jungle, you need to move on and disappear. That's not the way the Democrats think. And I think Fritz Hollings would say that's the truth in the way he's conducted himself.
Growing up there, those aspects, do you remember your first childhood job, Billy?
Yes, that was a tradition. My daddy told me that his father and his father before him, it started with his father before him. My daddy was named Joseph Holliday, and his grandfather was Joseph Holliday. Joseph Holliday insisted that everybody that grew up in Galvins Ferry would work on the farm. So he had all of his children. He had numerous children. And they all went off to schools in Virginia and different places. But before they did, they worked in the fields.
Yeah, this is boys and girls.
Yeah, well, yes, it was. Yes, and probably more emphasis on the boys. But
Right.
But I remember my sister and I went out and picked cotton in the early 50s one time, and I probably lasted 15 minutes, 30 minutes. But at least we did it.
Yeah, at least you made that first step, absolutely. And of course, oftentimes folks will ask your first childhood job and then your first job as an adult. Of course, that impact of getting out on the farm as your first childhood job, and of course, obviously spending a lot of time in the store as well. I think you said renting out or selling kerosene.
That's right, selling fatback meat, which we hooked up with a big iron hook, laid it out on brown paper, pulled string from the ceiling down, tied it. There was no money to speak of then. There were coupons that my daddy's father and he had given out to the various people who lived and worked and farmed with us, so that they would come in and cash in their coupons in return for whatever credit they got in their whatever crops they sold.
Billy, did you stay here for schooling, for college, or did you go off?
I was at Ainer High School, grammar school, I should say, until the 8th grade, and then I went up to Asheville School, which was a boarding school in Asheville, North Carolina.
Right.
And in fact, so many of the generation before me did that because the education system was not, as good as it is now. So my grandfather went away to a boarding school in Kentucky, and all of his sisters did up at Mary Baldwin in Virginia,
Right.
different places like that. There was a tradition of going to the Citadel. I didn't follow that tradition, I'm proud to say, because I would have not made it. It's just too rough. And so I went to Washington Lee University, and I studied English there.
That's right. I think I saw you got your Bachelor of Arts in English and then went into the military service almost immediately thereafter. What, into the Air Force?
Yeah, that was after I graduated. I went to the University of South Carolina, and I felt great dependence on my father, and he expected me to go back. And so I went to South Carolina and took business administration, and it was very depressing because I'm not oriented in that direction as far as numbers go. And so I did something that brought me to this Air Force base in around 1966.
Really?
I came down here, and it was during the Vietnam War, and you either stayed in school, or you were drafted, or you volunteered, or you joined the reserves, or the National Guard. So I came down here just in 1966, took a test, and I'll never forget it. I passed by one of those buildings where I went in and met the recruiting officer, and that's where I went off into a small room, took the test for 45 minutes, came back, waited outside as I've just waited for you for just a few minutes, and the sergeant called me in, and he says, "Congratulations, Mr. Holliday. You have scored the highest on the verbal that we've ever seen." There were two parts of the test, verbal and mechanic. And then he said, "But as far as the mechanic," and he looked over ahead. I'll never forget, Scotty was his helper there. He was Sergeant Scott, and this was Sergeant Moore. He says, "Scotty and I are really worried, Mr. Holliday. We hope you didn't try to drive here today."
Oh, wow. Oh, my God.
That's
was something you never
That was
forget.
a very tactful way of his comment on my
Saying you
mechanical score.
You'd bombed the mechanical, yes. That's
So
hilarious.
it came back in full memory as I drove in today in this base, which hasn't changed a whole lot.
No, it has not. There have been quite a bit of, they've been moving a lot of the buildings out, unfortunately.
I know.
And getting ready for quite a bit of development, of course, a new church.
The spaciousness of it and brings back, it's like I was telling you, you come back to a certain ground and there's a certain energy there, and you remember it. And that's what I remember. Of course, coming here to meetings quite a lot, too.
Absolutely. Energy is a key word, and I'm so glad you talk about the Galvin's Ferry stump that way, or just Galvin's Ferry that way, because the stump provides a lot of energy. Over the last 4 or 5 weeks, we've had a guest in every week and highlighting it. Russ will be with us next Monday, the day of the event. It's just so exciting to think of the key tie-ins there on a day-to-day basis that make you feel so empowered.
Yes, and that, as I say, that probably goes back to the first time people met the outsiders coming into the county, and continuing on whenever the actual primary speakings began. We're talking about a century or more. We're talking more than a century.
Sure.
And actually, I was thinking as I was coming here that the time of the stump is really, there are two parts to it. The first part begins when there were nothing but basically Democrats here, and there were some 20 or more stump speakings, separated by 5-10 miles even. They used to be 15 miles from Galvin's Ferry. There was Jordanville. 5 miles is Dog Bluff. Just numerous country stores like Galvin's Ferry where the Democrat Party moved from week to week, and where the candidates came. Now, Galvin's Ferry from, say, 1900, let's just say, speaking in 1900 in this century, just say it goes to around 1955. And that's the mainspring of how it works. There's one of the things that I heard Tommy Britton talk about is that he felt like he was the first, he's going to be the MC of this year's events, as he was 2 years ago. And we're very proud to have him. And he said that he thought he was the first non-family member to do that. Well, actually, he's not. And he's actually going back to the way it used to be, when a dominant, somebody who's very respected in the party would go about to these stumps, and they would be the MC, and usually somebody who held an official position. In Tommy's case, he's just a highly respected man, a great Democrat, and he carries us back to the time of my grandfather and great-grandfather, when none of them would have had any outward to do with the stump, any more than they would, say, in running the church or something. It was just a fixture of Democratic politics, and none of the store owners would talk about having the stump. And neither would these men. But they were there, and they were known in the States, and they would spend time in this crowd. talking with people, greeting the various people who came, particularly to Galvin's Ferry. Mm-hmm. And I like to think they were respected, and maybe that did have some impact on who came. But the greatest impact was that it was the first of these 20 speakings. Mm. So that meant that the candidates declaring their candidacy and their platform were revealing, they really were revealing it for the first time.
Right.
So all the reporters and whatever else, they didn't have television then, but that's where they came to get their scoop. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And the upstate politicians, all the way up to Columbia, they would have come there because that's where the media was. Mm-hmm. And that's where they would get they'd get the candidates' views, and they didn't need to go back again. So unfortunately for the rest of the stumps, there was not a great deal of coverage. So that's one of the reasons that one of the things that stimulated this stump and made it the largest one.
Sure. Part of the reason the other faded out. Now, your cousin talked about her dad, your uncle, as having been a copious letter writer, and that oftentimes he would be contacting folks during the 2 years off between events to encourage folks either to be there or to get out and really drum up support. Is that correct?
That's exactly right. See, there you enter into the second phase. Remember I said there's two phases of the stump.
Right.
Somewhere in the 50s, 1950s, the interest in the stump as television became more and more people had television in Norrie County in the middle 50s. There was less reason to have these old-timey stumps. So John Monroe Holliday was and this goes back to what I was saying about Tommy Britton. He was the first of the family who actually stood out front and took a really outer role. He didn't just go into the crowds like my father did, or gather with the politicians beforehand, as my daddy and his father did, and his father before him. It was just sort of more of a private thing. With John Monroe, he did go out, and he did spend an enormous amount of time publicizing this and getting people committed. He was not one to say, to accept no for an answer. If they said no, he'd write them another letter. Rethink it. So that was the phenomenon. See, and so I would say there were two streams coming in during my father's and John Monroe's time. My father taking the old role, and I'd like to think that he had respect, and that people knew him and came out of respect for him. But then here comes his brother coming along, taking the outer role and calling, writing letters. So you have the two things coming together. And now they're still here together. And in fact, they're really more predominant together now, because now we have the old-time way of Tommy Britton, and I don't want to forget Sally Howard. She is, by representing us, she is taking the strand of when people at Galvin's Fair, there was a man named Press Daniels. He was the one that put on the stumps from the 1900s to the 1930s. Mm-hmm. So Sally Howard is representing the strain, the influence that where we, as the family, take the back seat, and we allow the Democratic community to take over. Mm-hmm. And with Russell and her family, they're following in the tradition of their father and taking a more outer role. Actually, by being here today, I'm doing a little bit of that myself.
A little more like Russell and Christie, I guess. We've got about 2 minutes.
Oh, Lord.
2 minutes, Billy. And I know we've touched on so much. We haven't been able to highlight much of your life other than the experience that growing up and obviously the time at W&L before heading into the Air Force. But that opportunity of now working with, spending more time, I guess, with your cousins.
Yeah.
And, of course, Sally representing you and your brother and sister at one level.
That's right, yeah, because it's now bigger things. This is the first time we actually have two families that have grown in size that are there at the time of this stump, and so you can have too many chefs in the soup. That's what you call it, broth. Mm-hmm. But anyway, so we are letting her focus it, and it's symbolically important to me because it goes back to the way my grandfather and my father and his father would have done. They would have not been open in the public at all. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. But thanks to what John Monroe did, it actually his publicizing it, caused it to become a media phenomenon.
Right. I think I saw NBC News had been there. I mean, the Today Show, many others, Good Morning America in the 80s and early 90s.
There's no telling how many times he must have called NBC News.
Is that right? Yeah.
They could say, "What? What are you talking about?" Then that one, he'd call back the next day. This is the most important.
Yeah. That's It's great to have somebody like that. I don't know if Russell and Christy are doing that now, but
they are following right in the footsteps of their father. They are into. He had a great energy. They have more energy than anybody I've ever seen. Calling, writing letters, traveling about the state. So.
And now the fifth generation's kicking in as well.
Well, that's true. Christy Holliday Douglas has the oldest children, and they're in their teens, some of them, and some approaching in their 20s. And I know that some of them have gone to the county convention and things like that. So, and then my brother Judson Holliday has two boys, Joseph, named after my father, and Johnson. So they're too young to really throw their hat in the ring.
Lastly, Billy, I want to ask you, when you think about inspirations in your early life and during your youth, obviously you've talked a lot about your father. Has that been the biggest inspiration for you for maintaining your involvement with the Galvin's Ferry Stump?
Well, the key thing with my father was that he was the oldest of the family during that time, and I felt a great obligation. He worked so hard, he gave me so many benefits that I felt very, very necessary that I help him to a certain degree. And I think what I did helped to keep the family unified, so that we can have great harmony, and which is with my father. I think that was his wish as well. And so I think now the two families of the two deceased brothers are working really well together. As I say, my family being understated and the other ones doing a more popular thing.
Billy, thanks so much for being with us this morning.
No, it's a great pleasure.
Absolutely. Stay tuned to more Carolina People with Billy Holliday coming up next. The event draws many people from around the state to a place that doesn't have a stop sign, doesn't have a stop light, has no main industry. The place is Galvin's Ferry. 128 years they've been having the Galvin's Ferry Stump. Kicked off in 1876. You can be there this coming Monday, but you got to make a little bit of a trip. People will be traveling from all over America to get out there. Ceremony kicks off at 4:30. The official ceremony kicks off at 6 o'clock. It's a day when there'll be a lot of traffic in Galvin's Ferry. The 2004 Stump. Get out there.